Crystal walked to the driver's side of the pickup, but paused at the door. She turned to Brian, following behind her at a distance, apparently waiting for her to make the realization which halted her. "I don't know the way back," she admitted. She clenched her jaw and swallowed a bubble of emotion which tried to escape with her words. "It's all right, I'll drive," Brian replied. "Your legs okay?" "Okay enough. I was able to loosen up the tourniquet a bit. It's mostly stopped bleeding on its own." They stayed quiet for the first mile of the drive. Crystal struggled to shift her mind from who they'd left behind to what lay ahead of them. She asked Brian, "Do you really think Petra's going to be all right? It bothers me that Clem wouldn't say." "That's because Clem is smart," Brian said. "Sometimes smart people aren't given the luxury of hope. Me? I'm just a dummy. But I've got hope to spare if you need some." Crystal almost laughed. "So, you think she'll make it?" Brian nodded. "She'll make it. She won't be the same, obviously, but she'll live. And she's tough, so if she lives, she'll work her way back to something good." "I feel too guilty to feel hopeful," Crystal admitted. "It feels like I'm betraying her all over again just to make myself feel better." Brian said, "Betraying her again? Crystal, it's not your fault what happened to Petra. You know whose fault it is? To some extent, I share the blame, but overall, do you know who's to blame here?" "The Decarax," Crystal muttered reluctantly. It felt so weak to pin the blame on a mindless creature. "The damn Homeworld Protection Agency, that's who," said Brian. He paused while he made a left turn onto the highway, then said, "What use was it to keep all those spiders alive, huh? I mean, in the end, what did we gain from it? You just got here, so let me give you the answer. Nothing. We learned nothing that's going to strengthen our nation or make the world better. Our government shouldn't keep this type of stuff secret. I do their dirty work because someone has to, and I'd rather be in the know than not. But I despise the hubris that says you and I deserve to know what's out there any more than Sam back there or some cashier at Walmart. The only thing that sets us apart from those people is we got selected by this shadowy organization that decided we're either trustworthy or compliant enough to handle the truth. And even then, I've come to realize I've never been given the full truth. I've been expected to keep my head down, do as I'm told, and trust that the elites know what they're doing and aren't doing it for self-interested reasons. And being a good little soldier, even when it's glaringly immoral and unethical, that's why we end up in situations like this. That's how good people like Petra get hurt." Crystal said, "I think I understand what you're trying to say, but I don't know if it's fair to blame—" "And what about Clem?" Brian interrupted, really starting to get worked up. "He's a perfectly capable scientist, but researchers like him, they're not supposed to work in silos. They're supposed to talk to each other, share their findings in pursuit of meaningful discovery. What's he supposed to learn out here all by himself? How's he supposed to figure out how anything fits into the bigger picture? I mean, you probably know more than he does about the bigger picture. We buried our fissure. You've gone through one. You've actually seen the other side." "You know about that?" Crystal asked. "Crystal, everybody knows about that. This might be a secretive organization we all work for, but something like what happened to you still gets out. You're a legend. I figured you knew that." Ignoring the legend part, Crystal said, "It's not really an other side, if you want to know. It's not like a coin. It's here, right now. We're in it. It's everywhere and everything. We just aren't able to perceive it. It's like, you know when you use a computer, you see pictures and colors and text that's all neatly organized for the user, but behind the user interface, there's pages and pages of code that's gibberish to 99% of people who use it. They're interacting with it, but they can't see it or comprehend it. That's how the fourth dimension works." "So it's more like the inside than the other side," Brian remarked. "Something like that," Crystal said. Brian sighed. "This is what I mean, though. Imagine if we had our greatest minds studying the fissures. I could read a book and learn about coding. Who's writing the book about the way our universe works? You know, What if we got people like Elon Musk working on that instead of dismantling bureaucracy, huh? He probably wouldn't even be interested in one country's government if he had access to what you know. I mean, no offense, but weren't you just a regular cop? Admittedly, just a regular cop, Crystal said, grinning slightly. Right. It's so backwards that you know more about how the universe works than probably all of humanity's greatest minds. Crystal said, I see your point. Still, don't you think it would cause chaos if everyone knew the truth? As opposed to what? The constant threat of nuclear war? Bickering over trade policies and bathrooms? Would it cause chaos or would it finally bring us all together? I'm not saying I know the answer, but I do know the good guys aren't usually the ones hiding the truth. The trees surrounding the hatchery came into view up the road. Brian could see Crystal was still processing their conversation, but he asked, What's the plan, Agent? How are we finishing this off? There should be 2 spiders left. And possibly a young one we need to look out for, Crystal replied. There was a recently hatched egg in the nest that Clem didn't know about. Awesome. Crystal thought for a moment, then said, I don't want us getting out unless we have to. Without bait, let's just drive the inside of the perimeter and see if they come out, or we can find where they're hiding. You drive, I'll shoot. Brian said, Works for me. Inside the hatchery once more, they circled the perimeter in search of the last 3 Decoracts. After 2 full laps without a single sign of them, they grew concerned. Maybe we should drive over to the feeding spot, Brian said. They might have gone back after we left. Maybe the cyanide got them. It's worth checking, Crystal said. She drew in her gun and rolled up her window. Brian drove them toward the center, maneuvering around dead Decorac bodies, some killed by poison, others by bullets. The 3 livestock carcasses lay in the middle of the largest cluster of bodies, which were too dense to drive the truck through. Brian said, I hate to say it, but I think we're going to have to get out to count these things. Otherwise, we might just be wasting our time. Yeah, the baby could be mixed up in there too, Crystal replied. They parked and got out. On foot, they counted the dead. Brian showed a pronounced limp but kept a strong pace. They found, as Brian had predicted, all 17 adults now lay dead in the clearing. However, the baby Decorac was still missing. You hear that? Brian asked as they searched. Crystal looked up. She did hear it, the helicopter coming to save Petra. Good, she said. She tried not to start thinking about Petra again and stayed focused on completing the mission. I have a crazy idea, Brian said. I won't complain if you say no, but it might be the surest way to bring that little one out of the trees if it's hiding up there. I'm all ears, replied Crystal. Okay, so the webs are flammable, right? They're woven all through these treetops. I know the last step for us will be destroying all evidence of these things anyway, so why not light up the webs now? Crystal finished. Seems efficient. Crystal thought briefly before saying, I don't have a better idea. The fire won't spread outside the wall? Nah, the webs burn quick. They'll burn up before the trees really catch, and just in case, we do have a sprinkler system installed around the top of the wall. Clem insisted on it once we figured out how volatile the webbing is. We can set the fire on our way out and turn on the sprinklers from the station. How will we know we got the baby? She asked. Well, if we can't find its body, at least it won't have anywhere left to hide, said Brian. It's not a perfect plan, but this isn't really a perfect situation. All right, let's do it. They drove back to the gate, and Brian opened it. While waiting for the doors to open wide enough to drive through, Crystal aimed into the nearest trees and fired an incendiary round. Her bullet struck a branch and sparks shot out, landing on multiple webs woven through the treetops, instantly setting them ablaze. No going back now, Brian said as he drove them out. They observed the fire on security cameras back at the station, but as Brian predicted, the webs burned too quickly to set the green trees on fire. Just in case, they set off the sprinklers which sprayed water onto the trees both inside and outside of the wall as the last few webs smoldered away. They'd just begun drawing a search grid to go looking for the missing baby spider when Crystal's phone rang. It's Clem, she said, answering. Agent Jennings, Clem said, sounding official. I just wanted to let you know that Petra is in the care of professionals now. They wouldn't give me a prognosis, but she was still semi-conscious when they lifted off. I believe she'll live. Oh, I really needed to hear that, Crystal said. She realized how exhausted she was for the first time. She felt like the end of their ordeal was finally near and looked forward to resting for a long time. I thought you might want to know, Clem said. How is it going at the hatchery? Have you located the last few Decoracks? 2 of them ate the poison, she replied. We just lit up the trees and now we're going to… Hold on, Clem interrupted. Sam just started yelling about something. Or at something? I'm going to see what all the fuss is about. Hold that thought. Crystal could hear Clem put the phone down and his footsteps faded away. Faintly, she could also hear Sam's voice. At first, he sounded angry, but the longer she listened, the more she realized he sounded scared, terrified. She heard a door, then Clem's elevated voice shouted something she couldn't make out. Gunshots punched her speaker. Clem? Crystal shouted into the receiver. Clem, are you still there? What's happening? Brian tried his radio. Dr. Bunting, Clem, do you read me? Over. Nothing. Crystal spun around in the direction they'd seen the helicopter. She listened and searched for any signs of catastrophe. You think the chopper's okay? She asked Brian, unable to detect anything. When he didn't answer, she turned back to him. She saw him examining the wound in his leg, pulling at the freshly scabbed skin and breaking the wound partly back open. Brian, stop, she demanded. He paused to look up at her. His skin looked pale and tacky. I think I know where the baby might have hidden, he said. We need to get back to the vet. Help me back to the truck. Crystal ducked under his arm to support him so they could run. This time, Crystal took the driver's seat without question. She'd paid attention to the route on their return trip. In the cab, speeding toward the gate, she asked, You think it rode underneath all the way there? Brian lowered his phone from his ear. Still no answer, he said. Crystal, we gotta get there ASAP. I know. They stopped at the gate outside the station, which opened painfully slowly. Crystal scraped paint off both sides of the truck as she squeezed through. She asked, Clem still had his pistol, right? I heard shooting. I think so, Brian said, but I still want to know why he won't pick up his phone. As they covered distance, they each sporadically attempted radio calls to Clem. Brian even looked up Sam the vet's office number and tried calling it, but still no one answered. Crystal didn't seek pity or comfort for her mounting feelings of failure now. She shoved them down, compressing them into fury and rage, and let those emotions fuel her onward. The pickup skidded to a stop at the end of Sam's driveway. Immediately, Crystal and Brian steeled themselves for the worst possibility. The office's front door hung wide open, and it was dark inside. The sun setting behind the old barn in the back of the property cast a broad shadow across both of the front buildings, but if anyone had been standing outside, they would have seen them. Oof! Brian stumbled and caught himself on the hood of the truck. Hang on. You should go search the yard while I adjust this tourniquet. I can't get too far with it like this. You sure you'll be all right alone? Crystal asked, already moving away. Brian said, If you find anybody, call me on the radio. And don't go inside any of the buildings until I join you. Then hurry, Crystal replied. She shouldered her rifle and pressed toward the end of the office trailer. That is about as far as she needed to go to find the first tattered body. Sam the veterinarian lay sprawled in the grass with a crater in his stomach and a smaller one just below his neck. To do that kind of damage, Crystal thought the baby must not really be a baby anymore. Brian was lucky. He must have crawled out from under the truck right as the adolescent Decorack began its attack. Otherwise, his leg would be dangling. But up close, the damage from the spider proved to be less catastrophic than Crystal first believed. The larger crater in Sam's abdomen had scorched the flesh and organs around it, undoubtedly the work of a small incendiary round. It appeared the exploding bullet entered poor Sam's belly right next to the conical carve-out from the young Decorac. I hope Clem got it at least, Crystal thought. She couldn't shake the logic that if Clem had hit and killed the Decorac, he would have returned their calls and met them when they arrived. She hated this truth, because it meant Clem either failed to kill the spider or failed to do so before it critically injured him. Clem, she shouted towards the large shed. She didn't care that the predatory creature might be nearby. She welcomed it. Come on out. Show yourself so we can finish the mission and so I can be done. Done with all of this. No light shined around the edge of the shed door. Crystal didn't have a flashlight. She shouted Clem's name again, but neither he nor the Decorac responded. Crystal looked back at Brian, saw him still feeling out his leg. Finger lax against the trigger guard, she cracked open the shed door and poked her rifle through. She let go with her left hand to find the light switch. Overhead fluorescence showed her a mostly empty space with a few dog kennels and large cages arranged in orderly fashion against the far wall. In the middle of the shed, the most open area, a far-reaching stain of brown darkened the cement floor. Crystal felt gratitude that no animals were in the shed when they'd accidentally brought the Decorac here. Enough innocent creatures had died in service of the HPA that day. Anything? Brian asked, limping up behind her. Crystal said, No. Your leg okay? No, but I told you not to go into any buildings. I didn't go in, Crystal countered, realizing despite everything else how petty she sounded. Can you handle the walk to the barn? She asked. Brian swallowed audibly and shifted his weight to relieve his bad leg for a moment. Contrary to his body language, he said, Yeah, I'm good. At Brian's pace, they crossed the yard to the old barn with holes all over its sides and roof. One of the doors hung crooked, offering a permanent entrance, or exit. Crystal guessed this building was long out of commission. Got a flashlight? Crystal asked. Always, answered Brian, flicking open a pocket on his cargo pants. He produced a black flashlight about the length of his palm. He looked disappointed in the yellow glow it made when he flicked it on. Might be time for some fresh batteries, he admitted. What it showed when he pointed it through the crack between the doors was a rotting barn coated in fresh, slightly green webbing. It's in there, he whispered. Do you see Clem? Asked Crystal. Brian swept the whole barn with his light. Too hard to tell, he said. There's horse stalls and hay bales. He might just be hunkered down and keeping quiet. While the spider had time to cover everything in webs, Crystal doubted. She appreciated Brian's hopeful outlook, but felt no connection to it. She thought they should just burn the barn down and be done with it. If only they could figure out where Clem was, dead or alive. If only he'd been wearing some kind of tracker or... Hey, stay quiet for a second. I have an idea. She grabbed her radio mic, stuck her ear into the crack in the door, and called out, Clem, do you read me? Her voice came back to her on a split-second delay, cold and crackly, inside the infested barn. Clem, or at least his radio, was in there. Lowering her voice, she said into the radio, Clem, if you can move, press your mic twice so I know you're alive. So intently did she wait, anticipating Clem's response, that Crystal neglected the danger of standing so near the crack in the door. Something thudded against the inside, knocking her back only milliseconds before a pinkish cone lined with needle-sharp teeth penetrated the space where she'd been resting her ear. Crystal knocked into Brian, causing him to fall back on his bad leg and lose his balance. She caught him before he went all the way down, but by the time they both recovered, the Decorac had vanished again. Crystal grabbed Brian's arm with a python grip. Let me take your flashlight. If I don't come out, promise me you're going to light this thing up. Do not come in after me. If I go down, I'm taking that damn spider with me." She expected Brian to argue, but he nodded as he gave her his light and said, "Roger that, boss. How about you just promise me you'll try to make it out?" "If I've lost Clem on top of what happened to Petra, I'm not sure I deserve to," replied Crystal. Brian looked like he wanted to say something, but it wasn't the time. If Clem was still minimally alive, he certainly didn't have much time left. Though neither of them expected to find him breathing anymore, Crystal still needed to hurry. On her way into the barn, Crystal gave one last instruction. "Hey, if you do light up the barn, drag Sam over here first. You and whatever's left of the HPA will have a lot less covering up to do if everybody thinks he just died in a fire." Brian nodded again, and Crystal slipped into the barn. The Decorac had created the perfect trap. Its webs prevented Crystal from venturing into any corner for cover, keeping her exposed in the middle of the floor. Molding hay gave the Decorac ample hiding places, as well as the stalls Brian mentioned. And to top it off, if Crystal fired her gun and missed even once, she would certainly hit webbing, hay, and old wood that would instantly catch fire and spread, she imagined, at an inescapable rate. She decided intruding into the spider's lair put her in too poor a position to hunt it, and opted instead to locate Clem and get out. She clicked her radio again, whispering into the mic, "Where are you?" The feedback she heard seemed to come from the furthest horse stall. She moved in. In the corner of her eye, she detected a disturbance. Shining Brian's flashlight on the area, she watched a group of webs vibrate rapidly, but saw no spider on or near them. She just missed it. To escape her view, it had to have scurried toward the door. Perhaps it was trying to further trap her. How is it this smart? She wondered. The others had behaved with such a hive mind. Perhaps being separated from the group forced the Decorac to behave tactically. She prayed she might still have a chance to ask Clem what he thought. Shining her light toward the door, Crystal searched for the spider while also sliding toward the back stall. Somehow, the creature managed to stay out of sight, although she could see the webs moving all around it. So interconnected, if one strand shook, it shook many others, making it impossible to pinpoint the focal point of the movement. Finally, she reached the stall, and it was time for the moment of truth. It was time to kill her last ray of hope. Although she knew Clem was dead, that faint hope had only been a mechanism to keep herself driving forward. She didn't want to see him. She was afraid of what it would do to her, but she steeled herself and turned the flashlight toward the stall. She saw his gun first, lying on the floor in front of a large pile of loose hay. Behind the hay, she saw 2 booted feet sticking out. "Clem," she whispered, stepping into the stall. Everything behind her went pitch black as the stall walls absorbed the outer edges of her light. Slowly, she moved around the hay pile, stepping over Clem's pistol. The slide was locked back, the magazine having been emptied. Clem fought to the last bullet. He must have run into the barn to hide, but the Decorac had found him. Crystal looked upon his body for only half a second before turning away. He was, unequivocally, undeniably, dead. During the time it had taken her and Brian to return, the spider feasted on almost every part of Clem's corpse, leaving behind a mangled skeleton and a bed of mutilated tissue. Hopefully, he flickered out quickly. Crystal's mind forced her to imagine he gave up fast, or else imagining Clem's final moments might have frozen her with guilt. Crystal backed out of the stall, preparing to run out of the barn and set it ablaze. But the Decorac detected its last chance to attack. It sprung out of the darkness, landing on her back. "Brian!" she screamed, throwing herself onto her back, landing on the creature before it could deploy its horrible mouth into her flesh. It writhed beneath her, hissing as its legs, each as long as her own, batted her from all angles. Letting go of her gun and grabbing one leg using both hands, Crystal rolled off of the Decorac and tossed it away. It was roughly the size of a sheep, but weighed about as much as a lamb. It helicoptered through the barn, landing on a web. It scrambled up to the rafters. Crystal tried to follow it with her light, but it was too fast. "You good?" Brian asked, looking through the doors. Crystal picked up her gun and ran to him. He shouted, "Watch out!" Brian watched the Decorac pounce at Crystal again. His warning saved her. She ducked and pivoted, causing the creature with its mouth already protruding to miss her by inches. Brian fired and missed, hitting the back of the barn instead. Sparks from his incendiary round caught the interwoven webs, instantly catching them on fire. Confused, the Decorac ran up a portion of unsinged web, but it was forced to run back down as the fire rapidly spread. Crystal used this brief moment to run out the door. Once outside, she turned back and pointed her gun through the crack between the doors. The young spider ran from corner to corner of the open floor, scurrying between its flaming webs. Suddenly, it turned toward Crystal's light and paused. Without hesitation, Crystal pulled the trigger. After 27 stitches, Brian, though slightly inhibited, was back on his feet. It took him and Crystal 2 trips over the course of the next day to haul every dead Decorac from the hatchery to Conestoga Lake in the horse trailer. Conestoga Lake was owned by the Army Corps of Engineers, and though a popular recreational area, it required a permit to get in. Brian's contact at the Corps managed to shut it down for the day and left them a boat with which to drag the corpses out into the middle and sink them. Brian told Crystal this was standard procedure whenever they needed to dispose of dead Decoracs, and that the bottom of the lake was probably covered with them, slowly decaying. At only 15 feet deep, this meant the dead creatures were mere feet below unsuspecting boaters and paddleboarders all the time, their shriveled limbs floating up as if grabbing for them until they eventually rotted away. Crystal followed the brief investigation of the barn fire which, according to the news, had claimed the lives of a local veterinarian and a friend of his, Dr. Clem Bunting. Crystal had reported the truth to Director Vega immediately after getting Brian to the hospital. She wondered if any 3-letter agencies had influenced the investigation or news coverage, or if she and Brian had just done an incredible job disguising the scene. One seemed more likely than the other. In their final conversation the following day, Vega informed Crystal that Petra would definitely live. She was already undergoing reconstructive surgery, and although she would never be the same, she was expected to make a full recovery in at least her faculties and abilities. Crystal found this to be a dim bright spot on the horizon of her mental state. She would have resigned immediately when speaking with Vega over the phone from a cheap motel in Nowhere, Nebraska. She'd told Brian she was flying back to Washington when he dropped her off at the airport, but after he drove off, she rented a car and drove until she found a place to stop, a place where she could be alone. Before Crystal could express her intention to resign in disgrace, Vega said, "Jennings, don't come back here. If you leave me an address, I can have any personal belongings sent, but everything here is officially shut down. We've closed up shop. The hatchery was the last active location to go down." Crystal had been expecting this. Maybe not so soon, but it did not shock her. In a moment of pure vulnerability, spurred by having her act of self-flagellation denied, Crystal said, "I don't know what to do now." "Psh, me neither," replied Vega. Crystal realized that to the director, so many hundreds of miles away, the impact of Clem's death and Petra's life-altering injuries became nothing but a breeze left over from the shockwave. It was an isolating feeling, knowing she had no one else she could tell about what happened. There was Brian, but while waiting with him at the hospital, she'd learned he had a family waiting for him back home. He saw the end of the HPA as his ticket to a normal life, not just for him, but for his kids. She thought it would be selfish to keep him tethered to his past for the sake of her own mental health. And so, in a dirty motel room in the middle of nowhere, Crystal sat on the edge of her creaky bed and cried into her palms. She had no idea what the future might hold, but once her tears dried, she knew one thing for certain. She wanted retribution. The HPA had their way of handling things, but, like Clem, Commander Graham, Chief Gilbert of the Prouty, Indiana Police, Andrew Laxton, a journalist who tried to warn people about the owl, and numerous Prouty locals she'd known since she was a child, the HPA was dead. Crystal Jennings decided it was time for her to define her own way of doing things. You made it out. Congratulations. If you enjoyed the story, please rate, like, review, or subscribe. For ad-free episodes and bonus Into the Woods episodes, become a patron with the link in the description. You can also support the show by buying merch. That link is also in the description below. To stay up to date, follow me on Instagram at The Warning Woods, and if you feel ready, meet me here next week for another journey into the Warning Woods. Thank you for listening.